Have you ever looked at a vintage car and thought, that thing is gorgeous? Look a little closer, because hiding beneath all that chrome and those sweeping curves is a vehicle that was, by modern standards, essentially a rolling death trap. Some of these features sound like bad jokes. Some were standard equipment on millions of cars. Almost all of them are now illegal. Today we're counting down 25 weird old car features that got banned. Buckle up, because the irony of that phrase hits hard by the end of this list. Hit like and subscribe. Let's go. Number 25. Hood eyebrow visors. Before air conditioning became standard, designers were constantly dreaming up ways to make driving more comfortable. One of the strangest solutions? Hood-mounted eyebrow visors. These were small, curved metal visors that bolted above the windshield on the outside of the car, sitting on the hood like a pair of giant sunglasses. The idea was to block sun glare while still allowing airflow. They looked kind of cool in a retro jukebox diner kind of way. The problem was the material. Sharp, rigid, unforgiving metal sitting right at face level for any pedestrian unlucky enough to end up on the hood of that car. European safety regulations started targeting exterior protrusions in the 1960s and 70s, and these visors were among the first casualties. By the time safety standards on both sides of the Atlantic tightened through the 1980s, hood eyebrow visors had disappeared from new vehicles entirely. Number 24. Floor-mounted headlight. Dimmer switches. Here is one that sounds insane by today's standards. For decades, the switch controlling your high beams and low beams was not on your steering column stalk. It was on the floor, right next to the clutch or brake pedal. So while driving at night at highway speed, you had to lift your foot off an actual driving pedal to toggle your headlights. The United States actually required this setup by law for a period. Federal regulations eventually mandated that all headlight controls be reachable without moving your foot, effectively killing the floor dimmer switch. Most American cars phased them out by the late 1970s. But for a solid 4 or 5 decades, millions of drivers were down there on the floorboards clicking away like it was completely normal. It was not. Number 23. Rear-hinged suicide doors. They are called suicide doors. And yes, that name tells you everything you need to know. Instead of being hinged at the front like normal doors, these opened from the back. The hinge was at the rear of the door, the latch at the front. It looked dramatic, it looked elegant. Film stars loved them. And if that door flew open while the car was moving, the wind would catch it like a sail and rip it wide open, potentially throwing the passenger out or reclosing it into an Olympic sport at 60 miles per hour. Real-world accidents involving this exact scenario were documented throughout the 1940s and 50s. Several countries and U.S. states started requiring door latch and hinge standards that made rear-hinged doors impractical on mass-market vehicles. Today, you will see them on ultra-luxury cars like certain Rolls-Royce models. On regular passenger cars, banned or engineered out of existence. Number 22. The suicide steering knob. The suicide knob, also called a Brody knob, a Necker knob, or a spinner. It was a small round knob clamped onto your steering wheel, designed to let you spin it quickly with one hand. Originally designed for trucks and agricultural equipment requiring sharp turns with heavy steering, these things migrated onto passenger cars in the 1940s and 50s. Hot rod culture loved them. Teenagers loved them. You could steer with one hand while the other was otherwise occupied. The problem was physics. If your hand slipped off the knob at speed, the wheel could whip violently, hit a bump, and that knob could snap back and break your wrist or fingers. Multiple states began banning them in the 1950s. By 1968, most major jurisdictions had outlawed them on passenger vehicles outright. Today, they remain legal on certain commercial vehicles with exemptions. On the average passenger car, illegal in most of the United States. Number 21. No turn signals required. Believe it or not, turn signals were not always a legal requirement. In the early days of the automobile, you signaled your turn by sticking your arm out the window. Left arm straight out meant turning left. Left arm bent upward meant turning right. Left arm pointing down meant slowing or stopping. This was workable at 20 miles per hour. It was considerably less workable at 60 on a 4-lane highway in November. Turn signals existed as optional equipment from the early 1930s, offered by some manufacturers as paid extras. It took until 1953 for the United States to begin mandating them on new cars, and even then the rollout was gradual. Before that mandate, you could legally buy and drive a car with absolutely no turn signal capability. Think about that the next time someone fails to signal on the highway. At least they have the equipment. They are just choosing not to use it. Number 20. No backup lights required. Same story. Different direction. Reverse lights, the white lights that come on when you shift into reverse, were not required equipment for most of automotive history. Until 1969, they were optional. Just optional. You wanted to back up in the dark? Good luck. The person walking behind your car? Also good luck to them. Some manufacturers included them voluntarily, and certain states had their own earlier requirements. But nationally, for decades, backing up at night was entirely your problem and everybody else's. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108, which governs vehicle lighting, eventually sorted this out. It took until the late 1960s for the federal government to make reverse lights mandatory on all new passenger vehicles. Before that, millions of cars were sold completely dark at the rear end in reverse. It seems so obvious now it is almost embarrassing to explain. Number 19. Running boards. Running boards were long, flat steps running along the lower sides of early automobiles, designed to help passengers step up into high-slung bodies. They were functional, practical even, for their era, and they stuck around well past the point where cars had lowered enough that you did not really need them. By the 1940s and 50s, running boards on passenger cars had become largely decorative. They did not vanish because of a single direct ban, so much as modern safety and aerodynamic standards made them incompatible with new vehicle designs. Contemporary regulations in many countries require vehicle sides to meet specific standards for pedestrian protection and side impact crumple behavior, which effectively rules out traditional rigid metal running boards. They also become serious ice and snow traps in colder climates. You will still find running boards on trucks and SUVs today, heavily re-engineered from what your grandfather stepped up onto in 1932. Number 18. Exposed sharp dashboard knobs. Open the door of any car built before 1965 and look at the dashboard. Really look at it. You will see a forest of protruding metal knobs, levers, and switches, all pointing directly at the occupants. Chrome-ringed, sharp-edged, rigid metal objects sitting at face, chest, and knee level. In a crash at even moderate speed, those knobs become what your body is flying toward. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 21, adopted in 1968, set requirements for instrument panels, mandating padded or energy-absorbing materials and restricting sharp protrusions. Before that standard, manufacturers designed dashboards for looks, not survival. Dashboard impacts accounted for a significant share of serious facial and head injuries in frontal crashes. After 1968, the chrome forests disappeared rapidly. Soft vinyl padding replaced bare metal. Beautiful? Yes, but genuinely lethal. Number 17. Bias-ply tires. Modern cars run on radial tires. You probably know this, even if you have never thought much about it. But for most of automotive history, the standard tire was bias-ply construction, where internal cords run diagonally from bead to bead in alternating layers. Here is the practical reality. At highway speeds, Bias-ply tires generate significantly more heat than radials. They are less stable in cornering. They are more prone to blowouts under sustained high-speed use. They wear faster and handle wet roads worse. In the 1960s and 70s, as highway speeds increased, tire blowouts were a serious and well-documented cause of fatal accidents. Michelin introduced the radial tire in 1946, and Europe adopted them rapidly. The United States followed slowly, and by the late 1970s, radials had essentially taken over the market. Modern tire safety standards require performance characteristics that bias-ply construction cannot consistently meet for highway vehicles. Number 16. No side mirrors required wing mirrors, side mirrors, door mirrors, whatever you call them. They seem so fundamentally basic that it is hard to imagine a car without them. And yet for decades, they were not legally required. For much of the early and mid-20th century, only a driver's side rear-view mirror was mandated in most jurisdictions. A passenger side mirror, optional, left entirely to the driver. The argument was that the interior rear-view mirror was sufficient, which it was when roads were quieter and cars were slower. As traffic density increased and lanes multiplied, blind spots became killers. The United States began tightening mirror requirements in the 1960s, eventually requiring both driver's side and interior mirrors, with passenger side mirrors following under updated federal standards. Today, modern standards require specific fields of vision and even backup cameras. But buying a brand new car in America in 1960 with 0 side mirrors, legally, is genuinely hard to process. Number 15. Rear-facing station wagon. Seats station wagons were the minivans of their era. The safety advocates warned about this configuration for years. The combination of no restraints and the worst possible crash position for a rear-end collision finally pushed regulators to act. Federal safety standards eventually required proper seatbelt anchor points for all seating positions, ending the era of the backward glass-box child seat. The engineering fix was straightforward. The will to require it took longer than it should have. Number 14. Lead-based paint on interiors. Lead paint. You know it from old houses, peeling walls, and childhood poisoning warnings. But cars? Absolutely. Lead-based paints and pigments were standard in automotive manufacturing for decades, used on both exterior and interior surfaces. The bright reds, yellows, and greens of vintage car interiors very often contained significant levels of lead compounds. Children sitting in old cars and touching surfaces were being regularly exposed. The phase-out of lead in consumer paints began in the United States in the 1970s, with major restrictions arriving in 1978. The automotive industry faced parallel regulatory pressure, and lead compounds in automotive coatings were progressively restricted through the 1980s and 90s. Today, automotive coatings must meet strict limits on hazardous materials including lead, cadmium, mercury, and hexavalent chromium under regulations like the EU's End-of-Life Vehicles Directive. For most of the 20th century, families were sitting inside a lead-painted box on wheels, and nobody gave it a second thought. Number 13. Asbestos brake pads. If lead paint sounds bad, wait. For most of the 20th century, the friction material in brake pads and clutch linings was asbestos. Yes, that asbestos. The carcinogen directly linked to mesothelioma, lung cancer, and asbestosis. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Asbestos is actually excellent as a friction material, heat-resistant, durable, and it works. The problem is that it releases microscopic cancer-causing fibers as it wears down, which is precisely what brake pads do during every single use. Brake dust containing asbestos fibers settled on wheels, roads, and into the air around busy streets. Mechanics were particularly at risk, and studies have documented elevated rates of asbestos-related disease in automotive workers from this era. The United States began restricting asbestos in brake pads in the 1980s, with the transition complete by the late 1990s. The European Union banned asbestos in automotive friction materials outright. It took longer than it should have. Number 12. Chrome bumpers. With no impact standard. Chrome bumpers looked incredible. Long, heavy, gleaming bars of chrome-plated steel sweeping across the front and rear of American cars in the 1950s and 60s, often with elaborate fins, guards, and decorative overriders. A symbol of automotive excess in the best possible way. They were also essentially useless as safety devices in any real collision. A chrome bumper's stated job was to protect the car in low-speed impacts, but there were no standards governing how much energy they actually had to absorb. Many chrome bumpers were effectively decorative, transmitting full impact forces directly through the car's structure to the occupants in even minor collisions. The United States introduced federal bumper standards in 1973, requiring that bumpers withstand a 5 miles per hour impact without damage to safety-related components. This killed the ornamental chrome bumper on American cars by the late 1970s, replacing it with the rubber and plastic energy-absorbing bumpers we know today. Uglier? Many people think so. More functional? Considerably. Number 11. Plate glass windshields. Before laminated safety glass became standard, windshields were made of ordinary plate glass, the same material as a window in your house. In a crash, or even just a roadstone impact, plate glass shatters into large razor-sharp shards traveling at high speed toward occupants' faces. Injuries from plate glass windshields in early automotive accidents were catastrophic and extremely well documented. Laminated safety glass, which bonds 2 layers of glass to a plastic interlayer so it cracks without shattering, was invented by French chemist Edouard Benedictus in 1903. Ford began using laminated glass windshields in 1927, but it took decades for safety glass to become a universal legal requirement. Various U.S. states and countries adopted requirements at different times, with federal standards ultimately mandating safety glazing in all new American vehicles. The fact that the solution existed in 1903 and took 40-plus years to become mandatory is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in automotive history. Number 10. Swivel front seats. Some car features were well-intentioned but poorly thought through. The swivel seat is a perfect example. Several manufacturers in the 1950s and 60s offered front seats that could rotate toward the door, making entry and exit easier. Chrysler offered swivel seats on multiple models, including the Dodge Polara and the Chrysler New Yorker in the early 1960s. The seat would swing outward when the door opened, presenting itself at a more accessible angle. The problem was that the mechanism allowing the seat to swivel also meant it could rotate during a crash. If a seat rotates in a frontal collision, the occupant is no longer in the position their seatbelt was designed to protect. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 207, governing seat retention, set requirements that effectively ended production of swivel seats on mainstream vehicles by the mid-1970s. The idea was genuinely nice. The execution turned out to be a safety problem with no acceptable engineering solution under the new rules. Number 9. No padded dashboard requirement. In the golden age of American automotive design, the dashboard was a showpiece. Gleaming chrome accents, polished metal gauges, hard plastic fascias, and decorative trim, all of it rigid, all of it unforgiving, all of it pointed at your face. When researchers began studying frontal crash outcomes in the 1950s, dashboard impact was identified as a primary cause of serious facial and head injuries, even at modest speeds. The connection between hard dashboards and preventable injuries was established well before regulations caught up. William Haddon, Jr., one of the founding figures of modern traffic safety science, was documenting these injury patterns in the late 1950s. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 21, coming into effect in 1968, finally mandated energy-absorbing instrument panels. The industry resisted, arguing change was costly and unnecessary. The data disagreed. Post-regulation studies showed measurable reductions in facial and head injury rates in the years that followed. The dashboard had finally been made to answer for what it had been doing. Number 8. Sharp hood ornaments. Hood ornaments were art. There is really no other way to describe them. The Rolls-Royce Spirit of Ecstasy, the Jaguar Leaping Cat, the Pontiac Indian, exquisitely crafted sculptures mounted at the very front of a car, precisely at the height of a pedestrian's face, torso, or a child's head. In a pedestrian impact, a sharp, rigid ornament could turn a bruise into a puncture wound. The European Union moved first, implementing regulations in the 1990s requiring hood ornaments to be flexible, retractable, or absent. Rolls-Royce engineered the Spirit of Ecstasy to retract automatically into the hood. Most manufacturers simply eliminated standalone ornaments. The Jaguar Leaping Cat disappeared from the hood in 2005. Global market pressure and evolving pedestrian safety standards have essentially ended the era of sharp, proud hood ornaments on new vehicles. They were beautiful. In certain circumstances, also dangerous. Number 7. Lap-only seatbelts. The three-point seatbelt was invented by Niels Bohlin at Volvo in 1959. Volvo made the patent open and free to all manufacturers because they understood it was a safety device, not a competitive advantage. From 1959 onward, every manufacturer on Earth had access to the three-point belt at zero cost. And yet for years, many cars still came equipped with lap-only belts, especially in rear seats. A lap-only belt restrains your pelvis, but leaves your upper body and head completely free to jackknife violently forward in a crash. The resulting injuries, severe spinal and abdominal trauma, became known as seatbelt syndrome. The United States required three-point belts in front seats from 1968 and for all rear outboard positions from 2007. Between 1959 and 2007, that is 48 years after the superior device was freely available, millions of people sat in rear seats with only lap belts, one of the most frustrating slow-motion failures in automotive safety history. Number 6. Leaded gasoline fuel systems. Here is where it gets truly systemic. Leaded gasoline, fuel containing tetraethyl lead as an anti-knock additive, was used for over 50 years. It reduced engine knock and improved performance. It also contaminated the air, soil, and water of every city on Earth. Researchers have linked leaded gasoline to measurable reductions in average IQ across entire generations who grew up breathing leaded exhaust. The United States began phasing it out in the early 1970s alongside the introduction of catalytic converters, which leaded fuel destroys. Leaded gasoline for road use was fully banned in the United States in 1996. The World Health Organization declared global elimination complete in 2021. Cars built for leaded fuel had engine tolerances and valve seat materials calibrated specifically for it, making them incompatible with modern fuels without modification. A fuel system designed to help the engine turned out to be quietly poisoning entire generations. The fuel was banned, not the cars. Those fuel systems became relics of one of the worst public health mistakes in history. Number 5. No head restraints. Head restraints, commonly but incorrectly called headrests, exist for one specific reason: to prevent whiplash in rear-end collisions. When a car is struck from behind, the occupant's body accelerates forward while the head momentarily stays behind, then snaps forward. Without a head restraint, this motion hyperextends the cervical spine with enough force to cause serious and sometimes permanent injury. Rear-end collisions are among the most common type of traffic accident. And for most of automotive history, cars had nothing behind your head but empty air. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 202, requiring head restraints on front seats, came into effect in 1969 in the United States. Rear seat head restraints took considerably longer to become mandatory across all vehicle categories. For decades before that standard, millions suffered completely preventable whiplash injuries in low-speed crashes because nobody had placed a simple padded support behind their head. The fix was not complicated. The delay in requiring it absolutely was. Number 4. No door intrusion beams. Open the door of any modern car and examine the cross-section. Inside the door panel, hidden behind the trim, is a steel anti-intrusion beam running laterally through the door structure. In a side impact crash, this beam is one of the primary structures preventing the door from collapsing into the occupant. It transfers crash energy along the door, not through the passenger compartment. For most of automotive history, this beam did not exist. Car doors were essentially shells of thin sheet metal, offering roughly the same protection as a kitchen cabinet door. Side impact crashes were extraordinarily lethal well into the 1970s and 80s, precisely because nothing stood between the occupant and the intruding vehicle. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 214, introduced in 1993, changed all of that. Before it, your car door was, in terms of crash protection, almost entirely theatrical. Number 3. No crumple zones. This one is fundamental. Bella Baregni, an engineer at Mercedes-Benz, patented the crumple zone concept in 1952. The idea is counterintuitive but correct. You want the car to deform in a crash, absorbing energy progressively because a rigid car transmits all crash forces directly to the occupants. The human body can survive deceleration if it happens over enough distance and time. It cannot survive instantaneous deceleration. For decades, manufacturers advertised rigidity as a safety feature. Built like a tank was meant as a compliment. It was the opposite from a physics standpoint. A rigid car in a frontal crash brings you from 60 miles per hour to zero almost instantaneously. The results were catastrophic. Baregni's concept was eventually validated and standardized, becoming a core requirement of modern crash safety regulations. U.S. and European standards through the 1970s and 80s required crash performance that only crumple zone engineering could deliver. The built-like-a-tank era ended. Thousands of lives were saved every year as a result. Number 2. The non-collapsible steering column. Picture this. You are driving a car from the 1950s or early 1960s. You hit something head-on. Your body lunges forward. Your chest meets the steering column, not the wheel, the column. The rigid, solid steel tube running straight from the steering wheel back toward your chest. In a frontal crash, a non-collapsible steering column was frequently driven backward into the driver by the collision forces the car's structure was transmitting forward. It was essentially a steel spear pointed at the driver's sternum, and crash after crash bore this out with fatal results. Ralph Nader documented the issue extensively in his 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Crash investigators had been cataloging fatal steering column chest injuries for years before that. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 204, enacted in 1968, required collapsible or energy-absorbing steering columns that compress on impact rather than driving into the driver. Chest injuries from steering column impact dropped dramatically in the years that followed. It took thousands of lives to get there. The law finally changed it. Number 1. Cars sold without any seatbelts. And here we are, the most fundamental, most deadly, most obvious safety feature that cars were legally sold without for most of automotive history. Seatbelts. Not defective seatbelts, not inadequate seatbelts. No seatbelts whatsoever. Cars were sold brand new from dealerships to families throughout the United States well into the 1960s with zero seatbelt provision. Researchers and physicians had documented preventable deaths in unrestrained occupants since the 1940s. Federal law required seatbelts in all new U.S. passenger vehicles from 1968, but wearing them was not legally required, just having them installed. Mandatory use laws did not arrive until New York State passed the first one in 1984. Between those two dates, millions sat in cars with perfectly functional seatbelts and chose not to use them, because the law did not require it. The government knew seatbelts worked for decades before requiring the hardware, then waited another 16 years to mandate wearing them. The scale of preventable loss is staggering. Number 1, and it is not close. And there you have it, 25 weird old car features that got banned, regulated into extinction, or phased out before someone else got seriously hurt. From hood eyebrow visors to the non-collapsible steering column, the history of automotive safety is really the history of how long it takes to act on obvious evidence. Did any of these surprise you? Drop it in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.